Yep, so we're here. So if we have issues again today, I next week would like to have this mic be able to move closer with the camera staying where it is.
Yes, we can certainly do that.
Okay.
It basically just get an extension of this cable.
Perfect.
And plug it in here.
Okay.
There would have to be some way to have this
mounted.
Yeah, or we have mics just like that one.
Okay.
And you just hook it right in there.
Okay. Okay. So if we could have that.
Until next week to do that,
we can do a test here in 7 minutes and see how it goes.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do it. Is there going to be interference if it moves? Okay. So is there something where we can put it on, you know what I mean?
Yeah, there's a little stand that we can use, but you're going to kind of have to corner this. Test.
She is a member of the Heritage Trust, board member, the Henry County Pioneer Cemetery Commission, and the Henry County Avenue of Flags, which is in charge of engraving veterans' names on the Henry County Veterans Memorial. So with her work for us on Friends of the Harlan Lincoln House, we indeed look forward to her presentation today that is going to connect a lot of dots and answer some questions about what brought Iowa Wesleyan University together from Greencastle, Indiana. We look forward to this, Pat. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Liz. It's so kind of a festive air having so many people in the room at one time together. It's been a year since we've been able to do that. Several years ago, I gave a presentation where James to discover and to realize all the similarities, coincidences, and connections between Greencastle and our town of Mount Pleasant. The more you research, the more you discover, and the more surprising twists and turns you discover. During my talk, I'll be focusing primarily on the families of 4 individuals: Senator James Harlan, Senator Alvin Saunders, Reverend William Ramey Cole, and Belle Babb Mansfield, adding in a few sideline characters as we go. Please, if you have any questions or comments, we're kind of a small crowd, feel free to ask away. And I have several of my history-minded experts scattered throughout the room here, and I believe we'll be able to answer any questions you might have. Greencastle was established in a bit later in 1835, and it's also the county seat of our own Henry County, Iowa. Both towns are located in the center of the county. Both are college or university towns. DePauw was previously the university in Greencastle, was previously known as Indiana Asbury. The name changed in 1884. DePauw, or Indiana Asbury, was established in 1835. Wesleyan, originally known as Mount Pleasant Collegiate Institute, was founded in 1842. Both have affiliations with the Methodist Church. Both have tigers as their mascot. And each university, for the first time in their history, recently selected a woman to be their president: Christine Plunkett here at Wesleyan and Dr. Lori White at DePauw. Senator James Harlan wasn't born in Putnam County, Indiana, but he went to Greencastle, which is in the county next, I believe it was right next to where he was born, went to Greencastle for his higher education at Indiana Asbury. Harlan was encouraged in his studies by President, at the time, Matthew Simpson, who allowed Harlan room and board in exchange for Harlan's services as a janitor or caretaker. Bishop Matthew Simpson was the first president of Indiana Asbury and served from 1839 to 1848. Later, Indianola, Iowa citizens honored him in naming Simpson College in 1860. It was in Greencastle that Simpson mentored young James Harlan and presided over Harlan's marriage to Annalisa Peck. It's also said that Simpson encouraged President Lincoln to appoint Senator James Harlan as Secretary of the Interior. In 1868, Simpson also officiated at the marriage of James and Annalisa's daughter Mary to Robert Todd Lincoln, the president's son. Annalisa Peck was living in Greencastle, where she attended Larrabee's Academy, which stood adjacent to the campus grounds of Indiana Asbury. Annalisa was orphaned as a child in Kentucky, and she was sent to Indiana, where her uncle, Dr. Lennox Knight, lived, and he became her legal guardian. However, Dr. Knight lived several miles south of the town of Greencastle. And so since Annalisa, and this is kind of conjecture, but since Annalisa attended school in Greencastle, she most certainly boarded in town. Annalisa worked as a milliner in Greencastle, which is certainly known. It's very likely that she lived with and possibly served as a nanny for the Milton Barlow family, who were also relatives of hers, of Annalisa. And I'd like to introduce the Milton Barlow family of Greencastle, Indiana. Milton Barlow was a prominent manufacturer of hats in Greencastle. His wife was Angeline White, who was related to Annalisa. This 1850 census record is shortly after Milton's wife Angeline had died, leaving 5 children. Martha, or Marthina, was the oldest, and Milton, who was only 1 year old, was the youngest. Anyone that knows me knows that I love cemeteries, and so I usually have to slide in a copy or a view of some cemetery. And so this is the Greencastle Cemetery in Old City Cemetery in Greencastle, Indiana. And it shows, it's kind of a close-up of the Barlow family plot. And this is a close-up of the Barlow gravestones. Milton on the left and Angeline on the right. As you can see, Milton died just a year after that census that I showed you was taken. He died in 1851. There's a story in DePauw history about the romance of the janitor and the milliner. And of course, they're referring to James Harlan and Annalisa. James Harlan graduated from Indiana Asbury, or DePauw, with the class of 1845. There were 11 people in his class, 11 students. Later that year, on November 9th, 1845, James would marry Annalisa. Matthew Simpson, as I said, presided over the marriage. And this is I don't know that you'll be able to read it, but this is a copy of their actual marriage certificate. After leaving Greencastle and spending a few years in Iowa City, James Harlan was elected to be president of the Mount Pleasant Collegiate Institute here in Mount Pleasant. There's a story told about moving the Harlan's household goods from Iowa City to Mount Pleasant, and it's called the Ox Team Express. And these are some excerpts from that story. Caswell Hanna, Hanna, had been a student at the Mount Pleasant Collegiate Institute the preceding year. And when James Harlan, having been elected president of the Institute, went to Mount Pleasant from his home in Iowa City to rent a house, it was then necessary for him to find some means of transporting his household goods from one location to the other. Caswell Hanna decided or agreed to do this, to bring the goods over, and he immediately went to his home, which I believe was in the Danville area, for the necessary equipment, a stout wagon and a good ox team. And he set out for the capital city, which at that time was Iowa City. There being no load, this was covered in less than 4 days, and the wagon was loaded by dusk of the 4th day. The next morning, he rose early and started for Mount Pleasant, nearly 60 miles southward. Young Hanna made it on the 4th day and unloaded his wagon at the little cottage in the block north of where the substantial brick residence of Senator Harlan was erected a few years later. This would be the present-day Harlan House Hotel, which is now apartments. In later years, Hannah stated, his initials could be found cut into one of the bricks of the old Pioneer building of Iowa Wesleyan, but the many years of weather action, plus the several coats of heavy paint applied, made it impossible to find them. Besides James Harlan, several other Indiana Asbury graduates made their way to Iowa Wesleyan. In searching the alumni records of both DePauw and of Iowa Wesleyan, I found there were way too many to mention them all. So I'll just highlight the presidents, in addition to Harlan, and those acting in the role of presidents. When you look at the names of the first 10 Iowa Wesleyan presidents, the majority of them came from DePauw, which I thought was very interesting. Reverend James Marshall McDonald, he graduated from DePauw with the class of 1851. He preceded James Harlan at Wesleyan, though he wasn't named as president. DePauw alumni records list McDonald as principal of the Mount Pleasant Collegiate Institute for 1852. Reverend Lucian Berry. In Greencastle, Berry succeeded Matthew Simpson to become the second president of Indiana Asbury, serving from 1849 to 1854. When Harlan resigned from Wesleyan after being elected to the U.S. Senate, Harlan recommended his friend, Reverend Lucian Berry, as a good choice to succeed him. He was president of Iowa Wesleyan and served from 1855 to 57. Berry expanded the faculty at Wesleyan and appointed his son-in-law, Reverend Wesley J. Spalding, as professor of Greek. Reverend Jocelyn, he was a DePauw graduate class of 1842. He was president of Iowa Wesleyan for 1 year, 1861. Reverend John Wheeler, he was in the DePauw class of 1840, and DePauw alumni records list him as alumni number 4. He was a protege of DePauw President Matthew Simpson, president of Iowa Wesleyan, and served from 1870 to 75. The Wesleyan Law Department was revitalized under Wheeler's presidency. Reverend Wesley Spalding, DePauw class of 1854, president of Wesleyan, serving from 1876 to 1884. And here's some pictures. There's Lucian Berry. John Wheeler. And Spalding. At least a couple of Henry County residents made their way east to Greencastle and to DePauw. Henry Ambler, he was professor of law at Iowa Wesleyan University, and he was awarded honorary alumni status by DePauw in 1867. And this is a quote from a biography about him. Henry Ambler was a man slight in build, with a full and luxuriant beard, as you can see, and in temperament and action, active and alert, a man of keen perception and efficiency, known throughout that part of the state as a lawyer of marked ability and high standing. Help. And then there's Myrta Mitchell. She was a graduate of Salem's Whittier Academy. She received a law degree from DePauw in 1893. At the time, newspapers of the day announced her as Indiana's first woman attorney. And that kind of surprised me. I think Liz maybe brought that little fact to my attention. Myrta Mitchell is also recorded as such in the history of DePauw. However, this claim hasn't held the test of time, and Myrta's name does not currently appear in the record books as being the first woman attorney. So I'm not sure what the confusion was, but early records indicate she was, but when you Google it, it doesn't indicate that she was the first. Myrta's admission certificate was given to her for free. She wasn't charged the typical $2 fee. That was kind of interesting that was the the charge to get your license, but they waived that fee for her, so that was a nice thing. Whenever there's a person of note or prominence, we like to make connections with them. It seems to be our nature. And so it is with Nellie Verne Walker, the sculptor of the James Harlan statue that originally stood in the U.S. Capitol and now stands on the Iowa Wesleyan campus. Even though Nellie was not a Henry County native, Nellie certainly has Henry County ties through her roots in Salem. The Greencastle connection will come later. Nellie was known as the lady who lived on ladders because she was so petite and her sculptures were so immense. Nellie's father, Everett Walker, was raised in Salem, Iowa, which, for those of you that don't know, Salem is in Henry County, south about, 20 miles or so. Nellie's father, Everett Walker, was raised in Salem. Nellie's grandma was Abigail Mitchell, and she was married to a Civil War veteran named Welcome B. Walker. What a cool name. He was born in Canada, Civil War veteran, served with the 25th Iowa Infantry, and appointed drum major. Nellie, the sculptor, most certainly visited her Salem grandparents, just as the Lincoln grandchildren visited their Harlan grandparents here in Mount Pleasant. Nellie was raised in Moulton, and her first major exhibition was in 1893 at the Columbian Exposition. And Nellie is a cousin of Myrta Mitchell, reported as Indiana's first woman attorney. They're related through their shared Salem roots. When I first realized that Mitchell connection, I had to kind of do a double take and do a little more research, but it's true. It took a while for that to sink in. And this is an image of the James Harlan chapter of Daughters of the American Revolution in front of their namesake, James Harlan, on the Iowa Wesleyan campus. The statue was dedicated in August of 2014. This photo was not taken at the dedication, but some weeks later. And this is another of Nellie's more famous works. It's Chief Keokuk. This stands in Keokuk's Rand Park. It was dedicated in 1913. Let's go back to James Harlan's arrival in Mount Pleasant. Upon their arrival, James Harlan, Ann Eliza, and their family would have been introduced to the prominent Saunders family. Presley Saunders founded Mount Pleasant in 1835. His younger brother by 8 years, Alvin Saunders, served as postmaster, while Mount Pleasant was in the Michigan, Wisconsin, and Iowa territories. Alvin was a member of the Iowa State Senate from 1854 to 61, and was a member of the Republican National Convention, which nominated Abraham Lincoln as president. And this is a local newspaper advertising nomination of Abraham Lincoln to be president. What's interesting is Alvin Saunders, age 38, married Miss Marthena Barlow, age 20, in March of 1856 in Washington, D.C. How would an eligible Mount Pleasant bachelor, Alvin Saunders, have met a young lady from Greencastle, Indiana? James Harlan and Anna Liza, who was Marthena's cousin, almost certainly played matchmaker for these two. The two families would remain close. James Harlan and Alvin Saunders were lifelong friends. They died within weeks of one another in 1899. James Harlan in October, Alvin Saunders in November. And here's an older image of the two, Governor Saunders and an interesting sidelight is Governor and Mrs. Alvin Saunders' daughter would marry President Benjamin Harrison's son. And Paul Jewell gave a wonderful brown bag presentation about this situation entitled "The President and His Daughter, An Unusual Twist." Nellie was also known for her beautiful memorial statues in cemeteries. This is in Omaha, Nebraska's Forest Lawn Memorial Park. This particular statue is unnamed to my knowledge, but the beautiful memorial was sculpted for Milton Theodore Barlow of Greencastle, Indiana, Marthena Barlow Saunders' brother-in-law of Governor Saunders. The coincidences just amazed me as I kept discovering some of these things. Also prominent in early Mount Pleasant history is the story of the Cole family. When I think historically of the Cole family, I think of Reverend William Ramey Cole. He was ordained in the Unitarian Church, Mary Cordelia Troop. Together they worked in behalf of temperance, social purity, and the equality of men and women before the law. Their home was built in the 1860s. This view is from the 1870 Henry County Atlas. And the next view is the interior of their home, called Cedar Crest. And the next view is a more recent, though I think it's actually from the 70s, 1970s, more recent view of the home, which still stands on North White Street. The next view is a view of Boulder Lake, also known as Cole's Pond, now known as Crane's Pond. This postcard reads, "Does this look good or is it too cold? I think that is you sitting on the boulder." Reverend Cole created a club of youth who were allowed to use the pond if they signed an agreement to not smoke or not to drink. Boys could use the pond one day, girls another. And here's another view of Cole's Pond at night. And there's more information on this website about the history of Cole's Pond or Crane's Pond. And the next, this is a view with the boulder in back, which I believe originally came from the pond or from Crane's Pond, and they use that as a monument or gravestone for the Cole family, and this is in Forest Home Cemetery. And the inscription reads, I don't know if you can read it, but I'll read it anyway. To William Ramey Cole and Cordelia Troop Cole, and the home here in 1860, a home that became a center of organized work for temperance, social purity, and freedom of thought and expression in religion and politics, dedicated by descendants of theirs in 1937. There were 4 brothers in the Cole family, including Reverend Cole, and together they organized the Cole Brothers Pump and Lightning Rod Company. The family company was organized in Mount Pleasant in 1849, very early. The 4 brothers were J. Washington Cole, Robert S. Cole, William Ramey Cole, and John J. Cole. As you can see, one of the branch offices for this established Mount Pleasant corporation or company was in Greencastle, Indiana. At least 2 of the company record books, a ledger and several letters, were preserved, and as late as 1950 were the property of Dan T. Smith of the Harvard University School of Business Administration. I've not done further research to see if those records still exist and are still there, but it would be an interesting research project to see if they are still housed in that location. One vote of the board that was recorded in the corporate minutes reads, "We will not give employment to hands whom we have reason to believe are addicted to intoxication or drinking ardent spirits." And the next is, here's an advert, and this is from a Greencastle newspaper advertising the Cole Brothers Company from 1883, and another clipping from 1887. And it seems that, and I'm not sure of this, but it seems that Mount Pleasant might have just been a sales location only, and the manufacturing of the lightning rods was maybe done elsewhere, but I'm not certain of that. That's something that needs some further research as well. And then the next, I've got an envelope dated, the advert is dated 1868. I can't confirm when the envelope was posted. It's got an 1876 stamp on it, so it's probably after 1876 or thereabouts. But the return address gives the address on North Jefferson Street here in Mount Pleasant. Which brings us to Arabella, Aurelia, Belle, Babb Mansfield. Has everyone heard of Belle Babb Mansfield and her accomplishment as the first woman licensed to practice law in the United States? I'm assuming the majority of you have heard that. This is a very brief, condensed outline of Belle's life. And I'd like to add some more detail to this outline. Belle was born in Sperry, Des Moines County, Iowa, the daughter of Miles Babb and Mary Moyer. There were 4 children in the family, Belle and her older brother, Washington Irving, and 2 younger children, an infant girl and Miles Jr., who was born after his father's departure for California and the gold rush. Miles Jr. was not yet 1.5 years old when he died. In April of 1850, Belle's father joined the Flint River Company in Burlington and went west to California, where he died tragically in a mine cave just before Christmas of 1852. And this is Miles' gravestone. I told you I like a lot of cemetery gravestone pictures. This is Miles Babb's gravestone in Georgetown Pioneer Cemetery in California. And a newspaper obituary of the day reads, "Death of Miles Babb. On the 22nd of December, which was 1852, a sad occurrence took place at Georgetown. The Bay State Company's tunnel caved in, killing a man by the name of Miles Babb instantly, and crushing several others in a shocking manner. Mr. Babb leaves a wife and family in Iowa. The family of Mr. Babb reside near Dodgeville in this country, on whom this sad news will fall heavily. Sometime between 1861 and 1862, Mary Babb moved from Des Moines County to Mount Pleasant for her children's education. Belle and her brother, W.I. Babb, were teenagers at the time. In 1862, Arabella Babb is enrolled in Wesleyan's preparatory school. She was 16 and was enrolled in the drawing and painting department. By 1863, Belle is an undergrad and is a freshman. Next. This is Belle's Wesleyan commencement program. Belle graduated from Wesleyan with the class of 1866, and she was valedictorian. She was one of 4 students in the class. Her brother, Washington Irving, was a fellow graduate. In June of 1868, at her mother's home on North Adams, Belle marries a professor from Iowa Wesleyan by the name of John Mansfield. Belle is 22, John is 26. They are married by Reverend H.W. Thomas, who was a visiting minister temporarily on the faculty at Wesleyan. After her marriage to John, Belle begins to study law. And it's on the 2nd floor of the Union Block building on the north side of the square in Mount Pleasant where she read the law. And in the courtrooms on the top floor, the 3rd floor of the Union Block, Belle passed the law examination. On June 25th, 1869, Belle, at age 23, became the first woman admitted to practice law in the United States. Belle read law with Henry Ambler and his brother Richard Ambler. This is the same Henry Ambler who received the honorary degree from DePauw in 1867. So there's some connection there. Also in the Ambler brothers' law office was Washington Irving Babb, who was Belle's brother. At the top you can see an advert for the law offices and an image of Belle's brother. The examiners at the time, at left is George B. Corkhill, who was 31 at the time. Corkhill played an active role in the first Iowa Woman Suffrage Convention in June of 1870. He went on to become the prosecuting attorney in the trial of Charles Guiteau for the assassination of President Garfield. The other examiner was Edwin Van Cise, who was 27 at the time. Van Cise was secretary of the June 1870 Iowa Woman Suffrage Convention. And it said of Van Cise that he was one of the most intelligent, liberal, and amiable young men in the state. Belle was sworn in by District Court Judge Francis Springer. And this is an index page of the Henry County District Court. This resides currently in the county courthouse here in Mount Pleasant. And it indicates, and I've circled or put in red, it indicates that both Belle and her husband John were admitted to the bar on the same day. And the next page, this is the actual court record, and it reads in part, "Your committee take unusual pleasure in recommending the admission of Mrs. Mansfield. We heartily welcome Mrs. Mansfield as one of our members." This is from the Henry County Press, June 23, 1869. A woman lawyer. At the late term of the district court for Henry County, Mrs. Arabella A. Mansfield of Mount Pleasant, having passed a satisfactory examination, was admitted to practice law as an attorney. She is the wife of Professor J. M. Mansfield of the Iowa Wesleyan University. Her husband was admitted at the same time. I Suffrage Convention. This is a newspaper article about it. In less than a year, Belle becomes increasingly involved with the suffrage movement and was elected as president of the two-day convention, which was held here in Mount Pleasant. It was held in Saunders Hall, which no longer exists, but it's on the corner building, what is that, northwest corner of the square in Mount Pleasant. Held on June 16th and 17th, 1870. Note that Belle was president, treasurer was Reverend W.R. Cole, and included in the executive committee was Professor J.M. Mansfield, Belle's husband. This particular article goes on to say, the greatest enthusiasm prevailed as the newly elected officers took their places. Mrs. Mansfield is the recognized leader of the woman suffrage movement in this part of the state, if not, indeed, in the state itself, and we cannot but approve of the just tribute paid this noble woman in choosing her for their presiding officer. Several other familiar Mount Pleasant citizens served on the executive committee, if you can read some of their names there. I love this census report from 1870, so this is shortly after Belle received her license to practice law. It shows Mary Babb, who is Belle's mom, as head of the household, with her two adult children, W.I. and Belle, both declaring their occupation as lawyers. John Mansfield's occupation is shown as professor in college. In October of 1871, the Iowa Woman Suffrage Society met in Des Moines. Newspapers report that Mrs. Amelia Bloomer presided at that convention, and Belle was chosen as secretary. At that convention, Belle was elected to be recording secretary for the upcoming year. In March of 1873, a woman suffrage convention was again held in Des Moines, and in the Burlington Hawkeye, Mrs. Belle Mansfield is listed as serving on the executive committee. And this is, I got from the Iowa Wesleyan Alumni Directory, showing how Belle and her husband were involved with the faculty. It indicates that John was appointed in 1864 to the Chemistry and Natural History Department, and Belle was appointed in 1874 and taught English. Note that Belle received her law degree from Iowa Wesleyan in 1872. 1879 was a typical and very busy year for the young Mansfield couple in Mount Pleasant. They had been married for 10 years and were deeply involved with Iowa Wesleyan activities, with their teaching, Mount Pleasant community affairs, and social issues of the day. This is from the Free Press of 1879 in the spring. Mr. and Mrs. Cole and Mr. and Mrs. Mansfield represented this city of Mount Pleasant at the Salem Temperance Meeting on Sunday last. At the appointed time, a live audience gathered at the Methodist Church in that place, showing the interest felt in this all-important subject in that city of peace. Salem has no saloons and has not had for many years, yet there are those within her border who refrain not from the tempting cup. The speakers named above aroused the audience to deep interest, and work commenced to get signers to the pledge, and over 50 names were obtained. In the spring of 1879, the ladies of the local Methodist Episcopal Church, sponsored a loan exhibition. Displays were set up to show off collections of many of the local prominent folks. It was probably held as some type of a fundraiser. newspaper reports the collection furnished by Mrs. Senator Harlan was particularly fine and attractive. It consisted of many rare and costly articles, among which was the tiny bronze clock from Brussels, a Chinese vase, an album of the Senate and House in 1864, Japanese sandals, and Chinese shoes, etc., etc. Professor and Mrs. Mansfield contributed also a set of genuine Nast, N-A-S-T, Nast cartoons drawn by Nast himself in a lecture at Burlington a few years since, besides many curious books and other articles of interest. Thomas Nast, during that time period, was famous for being an editorial cartoonist. The Iowa Wesleyan commencement was held in June of 1879 with celebrations and speeches and gathering of the alumni organization. Senator Harlan spoke to the grads of 1879, and part of his speech was, "Don't go into the world thinking that you will not find people as smart as yourselves who have never seen the inside of a college. And don't go away with the idea that all knowledge is gained from books. The common sense and common practices of practical people are more useful and beneficial than college lore in the everyday duties of life." And he finished with, "Don't be grumblers and whiners in society. Be with society. Sympathize with society, always obeying your own conscience." And Belle helped during this time to co-host the Iowa Wesleyan alumni at the E.L. Penn Mansion on North Broadway, and this house still stands. And she welcomed 15 members of the class of 1879 to the alumni family. And this is one of my favorite pictures. It's such a treasure, partly because the names are mentioned or written on the back of the photo. It's believed to be the summer of 1879, and it's a gathering of the cream of the crop of local teachers and educators, organized by County Superintendent Dr. Lynn, who is shown on the far right, to form a normal institute. Standing left to right is Professor Alexander Rommel, then Belle, and then John Folks, who was a June 1879 graduate of Wesleyan. Seated left to right, Professor Seward Howe of the famous Howe's Academy, Professor Cochran, Carrie Reed, who was a painting teacher, Lee Hunt, principal of the high school, Alice Carpenter, and Dr. Lynn. This gives evidence that Belle taught in our local schools and as well as at Wesleyan. Alice, let me go back one slide. Alice Carpenter was one who is shown here, was one of the victims of the Tracy Pond tragedy of November 7, 1884. It's when she, principal of the local high school, John Wolfe, and 2 students drowned in an outing at Tracy's Pond, which is just located just north of the city limits of Mount Pleasant. Okay. At the end of the summer of 1879, the Mansfields prepared to leave Mount Pleasant for Greencastle. Professor Mansfield has been invited to fill the chair of natural science in Asbury University in Greencastle, Indiana, and himself and Mrs. Mansfield are about to leave us to take up their residence in that city. It is seldom, if ever, that 2 people leave a community followed by such deep and universal regret. We congratulate Greencastle and Asbury University for what is our loss is their gain. And who do the Mansfields stay with upon their arrival in Greencastle? None other than the James Cole family of the Cole Brothers Pump and Lightning Rod Company. So this census would have been shortly after the Mansfields' arrival in Greencastle. John, and I think I put a star by it, John is shown as Professor of Natural Science. I think my microphone just went dead.
Keep going off.
Okay. Is shown as Professor of Natural Science, and Belle as a teacher. I will try to yell. One article I read suggests that after relocating to Greencastle, Belle spent several fall semesters on the faculty at Wesleyan and joined her husband in Greencastle during the winter. DePauw Publications write of Belle helping out in the DePauw University. At any rate, Belle was very close to her mother here in Mount Pleasant and seemed to travel frequently between the two towns of Mount Pleasant and Greencastle. This is a slide from the DePauw alumni records. And in DePauw through the years, aren't we having fun? Okay. And in DePauw through the years, which is the history of the university, it states that no one played as wide a variety of roles in the history of DePauw as did Mrs. Babb Mansfield, as a faculty wife from 1879 to 1883, and as a member of the staff from 1886 to 1911. She served as preceptress of Ladies' Hall, served as registrar, and as professor of history and aesthetics. She became dean of both the art school and the School of Music. In 1892, according to the student newspaper, Mrs. Babb Mansfield was named as one of the 14 newly pledged men of the Delta Chi Law School, law fraternity. After 4 years at DePauw, Professor John Mansfield began to show signs of mental stress. In the summer of 1883, he resigned his professorship and moved to California. His death was announced in the September 1894 announced in the newspaper by DePauw University president, whose name was President John. Dr. J.M. Mansfield, formerly professor of biology in DePauw University, died in Napa, California. At the time of his death, he was at the sanitarium for the insane. For many years, his mind had been seriously affected, and it became impossible for him to remain at any length of time in one place. During all of this trying period, his heroic wife stood unflinchingly at her post as a professor in DePauw University, faithfully providing means by which her afflicted husband might have the best medical attention and the other care which he so much needed. She had, during those dark years, the sincere sympathy of the few friends who knew her silent and secret sorrow. A few short months after John died in California, Belle's mother, Mary, died here in Mount Pleasant, March 29, 1895. She was 74 years old. From Mary's obituary, she was one of the vigorous, strong women of her time. Mrs. Babb Mansfield, a professor in the college at Greencastle, was looking forward to the time before long when she would leave school duties behind and spend the remaining days with her mother. continued, there you go. Belle continued to teach and live in Greencastle, but she traveled extensively and was in great demand as a speaker. This is an article from from Indiana newspaper from 1902, and it's titled, the title of the news article is Women in Legislation, and it was delivered before the local Council of Women at Indianapolis. And part of the newspaper article about her talk says, Mrs. Mansfield dwelt at some length on the progress that women have made in the last 3/4 of a century, and said that instead of having but 7 occupations possible to them, as was then the case, they now found almost every field open to men also open to women. Of late years, they have also been interesting themselves in legislation, and women now take part in municipal affairs. Women enter into the administration of state affairs, of schools, and serve on school boards, and are active in prison and other reforms. Their entrance into national legislation has been postponed longer than anything else, and is not yet fully an accomplished thing. It is possible for women to affect much in national legislation, Mrs. Mansfield said, by working through their state legislatures, and though this process is naturally slow, it should be remembered that the women working for these things are working not for a day or for a decade, but for the ages. Belle died at her brother's home in Aurora, Illinois, August 1st, 1911. She's buried in Mount Pleasant's Forest Home Cemetery. I don't have a picture of her gravesite. Near her mother and her brother. One of the many tributes given after her death from Indiana. Her death cast a gloom over Greencastle, for her long residence there endeared her to us all. Here we go. In 1918, Ladies' Hall at DePaul was renamed Mansfield Hall in her honor. And next slide. And in May of 2008, Iowa Wesleyan honored Belle with a statue. And there she is, right out here. In conclusion, just to show what a small world this is, I'd like to mention a personal connection that I have with Greencastle, and specifically to their beautiful Performing Arts Center. Judson and Joyce Green are DePaul alumni and donated the funds to build this beautiful hall. And I'm very proud to say that Joyce Green is my second cousin, that our grandfathers were brothers. And when we took a research trip to Greencastle, my husband and I, me and driving around, I knew that they were big donors and alums of DePaul, and very into music, both had music degrees, but had no idea that they erected this gorgeous hall. So that was kind of a surprise. Questions? Comments?
So, the Mansfields had no children.
The Mansfields did not have any children.
I have a question. When you gave your talk last week, did you mention that Babb Mansfield had been the head of the art department? I'm trying to remember. I was at your talk.
No. So the question was if Babb Mansfield had been head of the art department. Not that we know of. Her primary faculty position was in the English department.
Okay, but I thought Pat had up there that she had been head of the art department.
At DePaul. At DePaul.
Okay.
At DePaul.
Yes, I was here last week.
At DePaul. Anything else? A lot of coincidences back and forth between the two.
and yourself with research and presentation. Connecting the dots is not just a cliche. It is the truth. In reality, to see all the relationships and the inner workings of the rural Midwest are just an amazing story in amongst themselves. And so thank you very, very much for sharing your wealth of information and putting it together in such an enjoyable, instructional way. So we truly, truly appreciate you. I'm sure you'll be here for a few more minutes if anyone has some specific question that they might want to bring to you. But once again, thank you. Continuing in our series, next week on March 16th, we are going to have a presenter, Dennis Wilson, from Mason City, Iowa. And his topic is on the orphan train. How many of you might know a little bit about what this conversation would involve? Anyone know about the orphan train? Good. Anyone think you have some family that might have? Good. Good. So I'm eager, because I think I fall in that category as well, to hear more about how this all happened through the course of a couple of decades, and what it meant in particularly the larger cities, perhaps from which the children came, and then to their relocation in the Midwest. I think it will be a fascinating story, and we look forward to welcoming Dennis Wilson. Same time, same place, both on site and virtually, next week, 12 o'clock, March 16th. And we certainly look forward to having you join us at that time. Now we come to a bittersweet moment. I am just so pleased to tell you how much the Friends of the Harlan Lincoln House have appreciated and valued the work, expertise, integrity, and enthusiasm that Anna Villarreal has brought to our Harlan Lincoln House. We wish her well. We send her off with great expectations for what she will accomplish in her new role in the University of Iowa Hospitals and Clinics settings. And we know that working closer to home is a big advantage, and we have had her assurances that she will remember us long in many contexts and return to us whenever she can. I noted that in Pat's presentation, talking about the Greencastle connections, there was a quote that I think is so appropriate here as well, that we send you off with all our good blessings because our loss is someone else's gain. And we truly know that you will be an influence and a remarkable contributor in any location wherever you succeed. So thank you, Anna. I know that she will appreciate any individual conversations as we adjourn at this time. So if there isn't any further comments from anyone, we look forward to seeing you next Tuesday, 12 o'clock noon, same spot, or virtually, as we hear about the orphan train presented by Dennis Wilson. Thank you for coming today, and thank you again, Pat.